Okay, we were discussing the problem of induction. A problem first put forward by the British empiricist David Hume, who's sort of the successor to Locke and then Berkeley. Hume is the third of the three most important British empiricists. Hume is more consistent and thoroughgoing in his adherence to empiricism than any of the three. And one of the consequences of that is this problem of induction that he raises. Starting from the epistemological point that all of our knowledge must derive from what we experience or perceive, Hume acknowledges that perception can be enhanced by the additional use of memory to remember what we've perceived. Therefore, as a thoroughgoing empiricist, Hume proposes that as a starting point of human knowledge, we have as a basis that which we perceive and that which we remember. And memories basically consist for him of recollections of things we've perceived. He understands perception broadly to include perceptions through the five senses and also internal perception. For example, when you perceive your feelings, like anger or jealousy or love or hate, even though those aren't sensory perceptions. They're still internal perceptions of a state or condition of oneself. So Hume's willing to accept perceptual acquaintance in this broad sense with data of the senses and also of our internal goings-on, including love and hate, pain and pleasure, and so on. So he proposes that we can have knowledge of what we perceive or remember in that sense. He then asks how we can have knowledge about things that lie outside of what we perceive or remember. We seem to think that we have a lot of knowledge about things that fall outside of what we perceive or remember. For example, anything in the future. So any prediction that you make would concern something in the future, and anything in the future is outside of what you perceive or remember, because you can only perceive what's happening to you presently. And you can only remember that which occurred to you pastly or earlier. The future, though, we don't have any way of accessing that. So the only way we can know the future, if we can know it at all, Hume says, is if we can somehow infer the course of the future from things that we've already perceived and things which we remember having perceived. So to have knowledge of the future, we must make an inference from what we perceive or remember, which would entitle us to state that the future will definitely be so-and-so. So one example could be that the sun will rise tomorrow. So that's a claim about the future. We predict that tomorrow the sun will rise. And Hume says we predict it on the basis that it's risen before, repeatedly and consistently without fail. And that's important. When something happens consistently and repeatedly without fail, Hume says, we can use a rational process known as enumerative induction to predict that that pattern will continue into the future. So, for example, if arsenic has always proven to be a poison in the past, if we observe that people who overindulge in arsenic then die a horrible death, right? We can conclude that arsenic will continue to be a poison in the future. So we can say arsenic will be poisonous tomorrow because it was poisonous in the past. And we can know that it's poisonous in the past because we observe people who ate the arsenic dying. And so we see that it's a poison, and we predict that it will retain that quality of poisonousness into the future. Or on the other hand, if bread has nourished us in the past, bread and milk, then we predict that it will nourish us in a similar way in the future. So Hume's motto is often stated as, the future will resemble the past. That's meant as a folksy way of stating this idea of enumerative inductive arguments. That if you have an argument that shows that something has been observed to happen in the past, in case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, that two properties F and G, like being arsenic and being poisonous, or being bread and being nourishing, these two properties are linked in past observations, in every past case, without any exception ever having occurred, to that pattern in the past, then we can predict that in the future that will continue to hold. As I also noted last time, induction can be applied in cases other than forecasting or predicting. There's also the case of inferring things outside of your sphere of perception currently based on inductive reasoning. So if you see a tree branch through the window there, you can conclude that it's attached to a tree that's rooted to the ground. And you do that on the basis of having observed in the past that there are no floating tree branches. They're always attached to trees, but now you don't see, all you see is just the branch. So if you conclude that it's attached to a trunk, then you're using induction to reach that conclusion. You're concluding basically that if branches haven't floated around in the air on their own in the past, they're not doing that now, and so it must be attached to something. Yeah?
What do you mean by problem of induction?
The problem of induction is that Hume's going to question whether these inductive arguments have any legitimacy. He's going to point out, first of all, that they're not logically valid, that they're in fact invalid arguments, that the sun has risen before without fail does not logically guarantee that the sun will rise tomorrow. The fact that bread has been nourishing in the past every time doesn't conclusively establish by logically valid reasoning that the next piece of bread you encounter will be nourishing. It might be rotten or poisoned or something, right? Yeah, so those arguments aren't valid. That's the first problem. So second problem is, how can you establish knowledge based on an invalid argument? Hume asked if there's any way to, in fact, justify induction as providing knowledge. And he's going to conclude that there isn't. So he's going to say there's no way to have any knowledge about anything outside of what you perceive or remember, which is known as Humean skepticism. He's going to be a skeptic about anything that you haven't personally observed, either currently or in the past. That means the whole course of the future is totally unknowable. And also whether the branch is attached to a tree. You don't know. You're just speculating. It might just be floating. And also things in the past that you don't recall, like dinosaurs. You say we don't really know that dinosaurs existed. One would have to rely on some kind of inductive inference from fossils, saying that imprints are always made by something, so these imprints must have been made by something. Therefore, there must have been some gigantic creature to leave these giant bones or fossils behind and so on. But if you question induction on the grounds that it's invalid, then we're not going to have any knowledge about dinosaurs or the future or what's outside this room beyond the little crannies that we can perceive to the outside. So that's the problem. I was just getting to that here. So the problem can be seen in terms of the inductive chicken that I mentioned last time. Russell mentions this chicken in his discussion of Hume. Russell doesn't agree with Hume. He thinks we can have knowledge based on induction. No, of the future, too. Yeah. Outside the room, the past, the future, all of it. Russell thinks induction is reasonable enough to give knowledge. Hume says no, so that's the debate, the problem. Which side do you take? Do we say that we do know the sun will rise tomorrow, or that we don't? That's the question. So Hume cites the example of, Russell cites the example of the chicken in discussing Hume. There was this chicken, every morning when the sun rose, the farmer brought out a big bucket of chicken feed, and the chicken gorged itself. And that happened over and over and over for a whole year. And then one day, the farmer brought out the feed, and so the sun rose and the farmer came out. Only this time he actually didn't have the chicken feed with him. He had an axe, and he chopped the chicken's head off. And so where'd the chicken go wrong, right? He said the future will resemble the past. In the past, every morning, the farmer has fed me, right? So this morning, you chopped my head off. It doesn't make any sense. Right? Right? It did make sense, but the chicken didn't know why, right? He was being fattened for the kill. So the chicken was looking at the wrong data. Right? But how do you know what data to look at, though? Yeah, he was the only chicken there. Maybe an eagle wouldn't have trusted the farmer at all, right? You'd say, well, maybe there's food coming out, but I'm keeping my beak and talons sharp. But chickens were more trusting. But how do we know whether we can trust induction? How do we know that the universe won't suddenly change due to some circumstances totally beyond our comprehension? Like maybe the sun will do something different tomorrow because of some factor of which we're completely unaware. Right. Maybe what we think of as the cosmos is actually the inside of a giant fishbowl. And there's some mega creature, right? Just like the farmer who's running the fishbowl, and he just drops the fishbowl one day. Drops our universe, and the sun doesn't rise tomorrow because everything falls or is thrown into chaos and gets jostled around. So, how can we say, right? So that's the problem of induction. How do we justify induction given that inductive arguments are not logically valid? So when they're not logically valid, right? The sun rose today plus the sun rose yesterday, and I observe all of these facts and remember them. The sun rose the day before yesterday. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Even though we observe all of these facts, say these are all observed facts, the sun did rise on all these days, and we know it because we actually observe it, we perceive it, we recollect it, all happened the way we think. That doesn't logically entail that the sun's going to rise tomorrow because it just says the sun rose in the past. Something could have happened, right, between today and tomorrow, right? That would lead to the result that the sun wouldn't rise tomorrow for whatever reason. So we have an invalid argument. An argument where possibly the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So that's invalid. Okay, so in terms of premises, A1 through A4 according to Hume's skeptical critique of induction on your handout. Let's go through that. So Hume says, first of all, the assumption that the future will resemble the past stands in need of justification, since this assumption is not self-evidently true. Hume says, any assumption that's not self-evidently obvious needs some justification. Maybe we don't need to justify that that squares have four sides. Maybe that's just self-evident. But that the future is going to resemble the past isn't self-evident. The chicken can tell us, right? It's not self-evident. The future may not resemble the past. So it stands in need of some justification if you're going to rely on that assumption in deriving knowledge, in extending our knowledge from what we observe and remember to things outside of what we observe and remember, like predictions. Okay. So how might it be justified? That's the question. That's the problem of induction. How can we justify this seemingly necessary, needful, useful assumption that the future is going to be like the past? How do we do that? Premise 2, A2, this assumption cannot be justified by appealing to logic, because an inductive argument is not logically valid, as we just noted. Right? So we can't say, well, logic entitles us to assume that the future will be like the past. It's some kind of like axiom of logic. It's not. Future could very well fail to be like what happened before. Right? Like maybe somebody made all A's in high school in every course, but then when they got to college, they didn't make all A's anymore. Right? It's possible, right? That could happen. Or maybe in high school they got D's in everything, but when they get to college, they got A's in everything. Right? That could happen too. Right? Like high school was so boring, but then like college was more interesting, so they did better. Whatever. All these things are all possible, right? However often or however frequent or infrequent they might happen to be, they're all possible. Now, Hume says there's only two ways you can justify anything. As an empiricist, he says either by logic or by experience. We can justify things in logic and mathematics, which express relations of ideas, Hume says, through self-evident reasoning. So he allows for that. And then he says the only other way we can learn anything is by experience. That's it. All right, so we can't do it by logic, so that only leaves experience as a way in which induction might be justified. Having ruled out logic as a possible justification for the assumption that the future will resemble the past, Hume then turns to experience. He says maybe we learn through experience that the future resembles the past. Right? Maybe we could say throughout our lives we observe that the future is like the past, right? Like every winter it's cold. We learn that. We learn every summer it's hot. And we see that the way it is in the past continues on in the same way, right? Don't we? We see that as winters go by, we say, well, the next winter will be cold because previous winters were cold. And then guess what happens? The next winter comes, and it turns out that the prediction we made is true. So we could say that, we could try to say that experience, in fact, confirms induction. That by experience we see that predictions that we make about the future turn out to be true. So you might say induction is justified by its success, and that would be an experiential argument in favor of induction. So might say induction is justified by its past success. In making true predictions. Induction, in other words, has an excellent track record in making true predictions. Okay. Is its track record totally unblemished, though? Is every time induction has been? You know, because it's chicken, right? So we can't say that induction always. So that's already a problem, right? Because inductive arguments are supposed to always work. That's part of what justifies them. If you go to inductive arguments that only work sometimes, things get a lot slipperier, right? I mean, do we know that a given person who smokes, say, heavily got cancer if he does because he smoked heavily? We might say it's likely, but do we know? Yeah. It might have been he got cancer by breathing asbestos or something, some industrial site, and the smoking wouldn't have bothered him at all. Right? That may be unlikely, but we don't know without further extensive tests and stuff. Just from the fact that he smoked, we can't say that he got cancer, because smoking doesn't always lead to cancer, just in a certain percentage of cases, if the smoking is sufficiently heavy, so on, right? And we see here that induction doesn't always lead to a true prediction, right? So its track record, although pretty strong, is not 100%, right? Not 100%. Like, yeah, winters are always cold and summers are always hot, right? But not all smokers get cancer, even though a lot of them do. So we can't say that just because something happens over and over again, it's going to happen the next time, as a chicken proves, right? Every morning he woke up, when the sun rose, he saw this big basket of chicken food, but not the last time. Right? He wound up part of chicken soup in that last attempt to verify the pattern. Right? So that's one thing. More seriously, though, Hume points out that this whole kind of argument is actually a vicious circle. It's circular reasoning. It's an attempt to use the assumption that the future will resemble the past to justify the assumption that the future will resemble the past. But if you assume your conclusion, you're not establishing anything. And why does it do that? Well, it says because in the past, induction has been successful, right? So past inductions have been successful. So therefore, being an inductive argument, then predicting a true conclusion have been associated in the past. There are two properties, right? F and G. Being an inductive argument, then yielding up a true prediction, are associated, right? In the past. Therefore, they will continue to be in the future. Like, how do we know the sun will rise tomorrow? Well, we're saying because inductions worked in the past. Well, not always, but suppose it did always work. That would only show that in the past they've always been connected. How would you get to the conclusion that in future cases they'll be connected? Only by assuming that the future will resemble the past, which is a very pointed issue. So it's viciously circular reasoning, Hume argues, to claim that our basis for concluding definitely that the future will be like the past is that in the past that the future has been like the past. You can see when you put it that way that it's not much of an argument. So A3, this assumption that the future is going to be like the past can't be justified by an appeal to experience either, because such an appeal would be inadmissibly circular, going around in circles. Right? It can't be appealed. Can't be justified by appealing to our experience of its past productiveness and fruitfulness. We can say, well, we follow induction because we're just doing what works. In the past, we followed induction and we came out pretty well. Maybe sometimes it didn't work, but like 99% of the time it worked. So therefore, we're going to conclude that induction will keep on working next week. That's just assuming the very pointed issue. Like, how do you show to begin with that the future is bound to resemble the past? Just because in the past the future resembled the past doesn't prove that in the future will, as a chicken shows us. Chicken just blindly accepted that things will continue as they have been, right? But that doesn't always work. Like every president revealed his taxes, right? But not the current president. So what happened? How can that be, right? Well, because he doesn't have to, right? There's no logical law that says that if past presidents did it, that the next one's going to do it, and he's not, right? That's why. So induction's not something that's logically valid. And it can't be justified either by appealing to its past success, because that's the very point at issue, is whether past success or a past correlation translates into a continuation of that correlation in the future. That's just what we're trying to support here, and we don't have any way to do it. Then Hume says, A4, there's no other way to justify that the future is going to resemble the past. We've got to do it either through logic, by appealing to the laws of logic, or by appealing to experience. Logic won't get the job done at all, and appealing to experience leads us to a vicious circle, like defining justice in terms of just laws or something like that. Like when we said, something is just if and only if it conforms to laws that are just, using the concept of justice to explain justice. Here we're using the idea that the future will be like the past to prove that the future will be like the past. How do we know that in the first place? Right? We don't. So Hume concludes in A5 by logical deduction that the assumption that the future will resemble the past is unjustified. Inductive arguments, in other words, are not justified. Arguments, so they can't be used in order to extend our knowledge from what we observe and remember to that which goes beyond what we observe and remember, and in particular, predictions about the future cannot be known. We don't know whether it'll rain tomorrow or not. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. So then we go to the B argument. B1 and B2 to B3. This is the argument for Humean skepticism based on the result above in A. B1, any knowledge of a particular matter of fact beyond what we perceive or remember, like that the sun will rise tomorrow, or that next winter will be cold, is based upon an inductive inference from what we perceive or remember. Right? So we have data that we perceive or remember, right? And we make an inference from that to a prediction about the future, say. Okay. B2, inductive arguments, though, are unjustified. That comes from the A argument, A1 through A5. Therefore, B3, we can deduce that there is no knowledge of any particular matter of fact beyond what we perceive or remember. We don't know anything about the world outside of what we're now seeing and what we can recall from the past. So we can see what's in the room right now. We can see little bits outside the room, like over there and over there and over there. There's a wall there and a door there and a building and some trees. They're a part of a building and part of some trees. Right. Tree parts and building parts. We can't really say anything beyond that until we can perceive or remember it. Because to go beyond that, we need to make an inductive inference. And according to Hume's argument, inductive inferences need to be justified. They're not self-evident. But they can't be justified. Logic doesn't justify them. Experience provides no justification or proof that the future will be like the past, or that the unobserved will generally be like what we have already observed. So Hume concludes that to be safe, we're just going to say that we know what we can definitely verify, what we perceive or remember having perceived. That's the extent of our knowledge. Anything beyond that is guesswork and speculation, he says. Now, there is the matter of exactly what Hume's position is on the things we can't know. There are two possibilities here. One would be that he would say it's just sheer speculation. Right? When we talk about anything that falls beyond what we can verify, like the sun rising tomorrow. So it might just be sheer speculation that the sun rises tomorrow, right? Just guesswork. Yeah, maybe, maybe not. So that's one option for him. So if you have a belief that the sun will rise tomorrow, given that interpretation of Hume, then we'd have to say that you're really being irrational in believing the sun will rise tomorrow. That seems like a lot to swallow, though, that it's irrational to think that the sun will rise tomorrow, given that it's risen every day for like thousands and thousands of days, right? So one possibility is a sheer speculation interpretation. Right? That's not the only possible way to read Hume. He's not super clear on this point. We know that he says that you can't have knowledge of the future. That's definitely, you don't know. But is it just sheer speculation, or could it be something in between? Right? Could it be something in between that and knowledge, some like intermediate thing? Intermediate between those two is something known as probability. So it could be that what Hume's talking about is probable beliefs that fall short of knowledge. I mean, suppose the weather forecaster predicts snow, and he says there's a 87% chance of snow tomorrow. So what's he saying? There's an 87% probability that there'll be snow. Based on that, you couldn't say that you know it will snow tomorrow, right? Because sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. You don't really know, right? You don't know. But would it be just sheer speculation, or would it be based on sound probability if you concluded that tomorrow it'll snow? Well, seems like it has a basis, right? The 87% probability makes it a lot more likely that it will snow tomorrow than that it won't. But it falls short of knowledge. So there might be a thing in between the two, a rational belief that falls short of knowledge, backed up by a high probability. What if the probability was 99.99999 of something? That seems like it comes pretty close to knowledge if it's not knowledge. Russell actually will argue that it is knowledge if it gets that high. Even though there's a chance you're wrong. A very slim chance. If it turns out, though, that the prediction's correct, and it had a very high probability, like really high, like that, 99.999, not like 87%, but like 99.9999, all the way out, Russell's going to say, you knew. Right? So Hume would say you don't. Right? Hume would say you don't know. If the probability falls short of 100%, in which case it's not probability anymore, it's a logical proof. Right? So there might be such a thing as a rational belief that falls short of knowledge. Rational belief falling short of knowledge. That makes sense? So like a belief of what the weather will be. Could be rational but falls short of knowledge. Based on probability that doesn't produce knowledge. Hume's position is that probability that falls short of absolute conclusiveness is never knowledge. Descartes would have agreed, I think. Russell says, though, that it can be knowledge if it gets high enough. even though it doesn't absolutely guarantee. It gets so close that when the result actually occurs, then yeah, you knew. I guess if the result doesn't occur on the infinitely small chance that it doesn't occur, then you didn't know. Even though you had a basis for thinking you knew, it turns out you didn't know in that case. So what's Russell's answer to this going to be? Russell says we can have knowledge of particular matters of fact outside of what we perceive and remember. He says there can be scientific knowledge, and scientific knowledge concerns many matters that fall outside what we perceive and remember. Knowledge of general laws in physics and chemistry. These laws concern all objects, past, present, and future, anywhere in the universe. We certainly haven't been able to perceive everywhere in the universe. And we certainly haven't been able to perceive what occurs at every time. So we certainly, in science, go beyond the limits that Hume drew for human knowledge, that it can't go outside of what we perceive or remember. So if we have a general law like the law of gravity, the law of universal gravitation, says any two bodies in the universe at any time will attract each other. So there's no way to verify that except by using enumerative induction, by saying that any two bodies that we've observed in the past have attracted each other in accordance with Newton's laws of gravity. Does that prove that every object in the universe behaves that way? Maybe objects in distant worlds don't do that. How do we know? Right? So that's the problem. Hume would say you don't really know. Russell says after you observe enough cases, the probability gets really high. And at a certain point, you do know. All right, so in attempting to answer Hume, Russell's going to sketch out the following theory. So this is Russell's response to Hume. So according to Russell, a priori reason, the kind of reason we employ when we reason in mathematics and logic, appreciate various necessary truths. Russell says, a priori reasoning is not limited to logic. Okay, that's his first claim. Logic is not the end all of a priori reasoning. And not just mathematics either. It also includes, Russell says, principles of epistemology that relate to probability, including what Russell calls the principles of induction. So these principles are stated on pages 66 and 67 of the Problems of Philosophy, which I hope you have with you. But if you don't, I'll quote. Russell puts forward a principle of induction which has two parts. One part concerns next instance enumerative induction, and the other concerns universal generalizations through enumerative induction. Remember, there are two types of enumerative induction. One where you infer to the next instance of the pattern, and the other in which you infer that all cases in the universe follow the pattern, which is a universal generalization induction. Okay, so the next instance induction goes like this. Part A of the first part. When a thing of a certain sort, A, has been found to be associated with a thing of a certain other sort, B, so A and B, right? Like winter and cold, right? Bread and nourishing, arsenic and poisonous, diamond and hard, and has never been found disassociated from B. So we never found a soft diamond. the greater the number of cases in which A and B have been associated, the greater is the probability that they will be associated in the next case in which one of them is known to be present. So what is this saying? The more cases you observe of the pattern of association, the greater the probability becomes that they will be associated in the case following the one that you just observed. So what he's saying is, as you observe the association of, say, diamond and hard over and over and over again, the probability is constantly rising that the next case after the last one you observed will also follow the pattern. And so as you observe more and more cases, what's going to happen to the probability? It's going to gradually go up, right? It's going to continue to rise. Every time you observe another case, it's more evidence. And the probability gets higher and higher and higher. Okay. Under the same circumstances, a sufficient number of cases of association will make the probability of a fresh association nearly a certainty and will make it approach certainty without limit. So now he's talking about the 99.99999, right? Saying you get enough cases, like thousands and thousands and thousands of these cases, and there's never any exception. Right? The probability is going to approach 100%. Now, granted, it'll never get there, never get to 100%, but it'll get like super close. Tell you 99.999% likely. Okay, and then there's a parallel principle on page 67, almost exactly the same, that deals with universal generalizations. So here we're just talking about the next instance. But now we can make a similar claim, Russell says, about universal generalizations. This one goes like this. The greater the number of cases in which a thing of the sort A has been found associated with a thing of the sort B, the more probable it is, if no cases of failure of association are known, that A is always associated with B. Right? Not just that in the next case it will be, but that they're always going to be associated. Under the same circumstances, a sufficient number of cases of the association of A with B will make it nearly certain that A is always associated with B, and will make this general law approach certainty without limit. So through this method, you could conclude by the next instance principle that it's highly likely that the sun will rise tomorrow, and also that it's highly likely that the law of universal gravitation is true. Okay. So these are principles of probability. They don't claim that you can prove absolutely that these are true. All you're going to get is that they're like 99.99% likely to be true. All right. But according to Russell, those principles of induction are themselves necessarily true and a priori, the principles of probability. He says these are principles of human rationality constitutive of what we mean by being reasonable or rational, so that a rational person would be entirely justified in saying that these principles are self-evident, at least. That the rational man will, after having observed the association of A and B in every case throughout his life, is going to rationally conclude that it's highly likely that they'll continue to be associated, saying that's a self-evident truth. So, this principle of induction states, then, that as the number of observations which consistently support a generalization increases, so does the probability of the truth of that generalization. So which premise would Russell be rejecting in Hume's original skeptical argument here? Russell's agreeing with A1 that induction needs some justification because it's not self-evident. That is, he agrees that it is not self-evidently true that the future will resemble the past. The most that can be said is that it's highly likely, but not self-evident. He agrees that we can't justify it by appealing to logic because the principles of induction are not logical principles. He concedes that we can't justify it by appealing to experience because that's going to be a vicious circle, assuming that induction, you're going to be assuming that induction is justified to justify induction. So it must be A4. That's the only thing left that he denies. He says there is another way to justify this assumption, something different than either an appeal to logic alone or experience alone. What is it? It's an appeal to two things together. It's an appeal to an a priori or necessarily true principle of probability, of inductive probability, together with experience. So it's going to be, Russell's going to appeal to experience plus an a priori principle of probability. They're saying there's an a priori, something that can be known as an obvious truth, a priori principle of induction. This principle doesn't say that the future will resemble the past. What it says is that as the number of cases that you observe increase, a particular prediction that the next case or that all cases will follow the pattern already verified will become more and more likely. That's the thing that's a priori. Not that the future is going to be like the past, but that there's a probability, a rising probability that it will be like the past. Right? That's different. From that, you can't conclude that the sun will rise tomorrow. What can you conclude? Only that it's likely that the sun will rise. That's what you can get, right? That's different than concluding that it will, right? You can conclude that it's likely that it will. That's very different. But the likelihood, he says, rises all the time. So it gets higher and higher and higher and builds up. So you have this a priori principle induction plus observations of uniformity in nature. We observe in nature these uniformities, right? Like cold and winter, diamond and hard, arsenic and poisonous, bodies attracting, right? All these uniformities. The sun rising, right? Every day. So there are these uniformities in nature. Okay, and the two of these together lead to, right, this principle of induction that we've stated, plus the uniformities lead to the conclusion, logically, right, that it's highly probable that in certain respects the future is going to be like the past. So that becomes highly probable in general from these two, since we have all these particular observations of associations of properties, like cold and winter and hot and summer and diamond and hard and arsenic and poisonous and bread and nourishing, etc., etc., etc. You add all those up and you apply the principle of induction that when you have experiences of these uniformities without exception, the probabilities build up, then you get that it's highly likely that the future will be like the past in all those respects. Highly likely. It is highly likely that the future will be like the past. So this becomes highly likely. And Russell says that's the best we can do. That's how we can justify the assumption that the future will be like the past. We can logically derive from observation, which we know through experience, together with an a priori necessary truth about the rationality of inductive reasoning. that it's highly likely that the future is going to be like the past. On that basis, Russell tries to maintain that we can have knowledge of the future based on the high likelihood of the future being like the past. So, a combination of reason and experience for Russell justify the assumption that the future will be like the past. They don't absolutely prove it, they just justify it to the extent of showing that it's highly probable, meaning like 99% or even higher than that. At that point, I guess he wants to say you're just quibbling, whatever, if you say we don't know that the future resembles the past. If it's 99.999% likely, like, okay, there's a chance I'm wrong. Very, very small, so who cares? Yeah. Okay, so what might Hume say in answer? Okay, well, the first thing, you might argue that a priori reasoning is in fact limited to logic and mathematics, and hence that we can't know can't know Russell's principle of induction a priori. So that would be one point that Hume would probably make. I'm pretty sure he would maintain that. He thought that the realm of the a priori was limited to logic and mathematics, I think, like arithmetic and geometry and logic. Russell wants to say it also can include probability theory. Right? Why not? Right? Why can't we have a priori insights into the nature of probability? Well, I guess Hume would say, so long as it's purely mathematical probability, you can, but not if you apply it to the rationality of beliefs. Russell says you can, so it seems like a very difficult point to try to settle. Putting that aside, you might argue in response to Russell that even if Russell's argument is accepted to a point, knowledge still requires conclusive evidence, at least if we follow Descartes, and not mere probability. Hume would say mere probability is not enough to establish knowledge. Just because it's highly likely that it will rain tomorrow doesn't mean we know that it will rain. For knowledge, you need something extra beyond probability, where you can say, I can deduce this logically from my evidence and show that, given that my evidence, this must be true, the thing that I claim to know. So Hume would have higher standards than Russell. He would say even if it's highly probable that the future is going to resemble the past, or highly likely, this does not show that we know that the future will resemble the past. It's just a high probability. And I guess there Russell would say, if you want to use the word know that way, so strictly I guess you can, but I choose not to because it's more in accord with our ordinary ways of speaking and talking to say that we do know the sun will rise tomorrow, given the extreme probability of that event, even though there is some very small chance something might prevent it. It's negligible, and so we'll put it aside. So that would be the dispute between them there. You might say Hume has a higher standard for knowledge. Hume's like the teacher who says, I'm not going to give you an A unless you have like 100% average. Maybe. Whereas Russell's saying, I'm willing to give you an A even if you have a 90 average or a 95 average, because that's good enough for an A. Whereas Hume is saying it has to be 100%. So he has a higher standard for knowledge, which is, like I say, analogous to what standard a professor might have in a class for a given grade. Some professor can have a higher standard and some professor a lower. Like some professor might require an 80 for a B and another an 83, whatever, right? So different view about what level has to be reached in order to say that it makes the grade. All right, so there does appear to be a way out of Hume's skeptical critique, at least possibly, if we're willing to accept Russell's arguments. Trouble with Hume's view is this is so negative, right? I mean, we'll have no ability to have knowledge of any facts about the physical universe beyond what we've observed ourselves. And if you insist on extreme infallibility about everything, like Descartes and Hume both do, actually, it's not clear that you can even have knowledge through memory. Right? Are our memories infallible? Far from it. They seem to be like just as fallible as inductive inferences, right? How often does it happen that two people swear they both remember something and they remember the opposite thing? Like one of them is wrong, one or both. One or both of the people are wrong. They both can swear that they remember that what they think happened, but one or both are in error. So memory is not infallible. So maybe that should be thrown out too. And perception is not infallible either. People can see things that aren't there. Right? So it doesn't seem like we'll be left with very much if we insist on infallibility for all knowledge. So if we allow for some fallible knowledge, fallible human knowledge, then it looks like we could justify the use of induction just as much as any other fallible form of human cognition. Okay, any questions or comments? Then we still have 15 minutes to go, so perhaps we could start reviewing study questions, which will continue into the next period. And then after that, we have reading day, which is not a class.
So we have a class this Thursday?
We have a class on Thursday, yes, our last class aside from the final.
Because on the schedule it doesn't say that we have class. For some reason, I just don't see.
Does it? What's the last date on there? Today's the 25th.
Oh, it just doesn't have anything on it. Right.
Is there a 27th on there?
Yeah, it just doesn't have anything on it. So I just got confused.
Oh, okay. The date's on there, right?
Yeah, the date.
Yeah, it's because I figured it would probably be for review, which is what it will be for. So, okay, so changing gears now. The first study question concerns the problem of universals, in particular the distinction between concrete entities and abstract entities. And the question posed asks, what are some of the characteristics which distinguish concrete entities and abstract entities? Anybody remember any of those? There were 4 pairs such that they were sort of opposites. So concrete entities would be one, and then abstract entities would have the opposite. And there were 4 of those. So the first was that concrete entities typically are in space or time. They have a location if they're concrete. So that would make this table or this little desk thingy a concrete object because it has a location in space and time. It's here now. So entities that have that characteristic are generally concrete entities if they're located in space and time. Anything that's physical will meet that definition. Yeah. So materialists are often regarded as advocates of a metaphysical view that only concrete entities exist. Materialism is a form of concretism, right? That everything is concrete. All right, so that's just one of the characteristics. Okay, so the opposite would be that abstract entities are outside of space and time. because they have the opposite characteristic. They're not anywhere.
Is it like atoms or
No, they're just not anywhere. They're not physical.
ideas?
They would be like dragonhood, the quality of being a dragon. The empty set, which is often equated with the number. What number is the empty set equated with? The number 0. Yeah. So where is 0? Where is 0 now? Where is it? Is it in my pocket? It's an abstract entity. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's an idea, though Plato used the word idea in that way. But that's a bad translation, actually. The original Greek for what Plato talked about was eidos, which means form. So he calls these things forms, things like dragonhood and triangularity and 0, calls them forms. One translation of form from the 19th century was idea. But it doesn't mean an idea in the mental sense. It's like an abstract idea, a form, a structure. Yeah, so dragonhood, 0, the number 7. Triangularity, where is that located? Well, you might say it's located in a triangular object, right? However, it turns out that you really can't find any triangular objects. Right? If you actually measure the objects, you'll find out that the sides are slightly uneven. So you really can't locate triangularity anywhere either. That's what Plato argued. That nowhere in the physical world can you find a true triangle. Either the sides are a little uneven, or they're actually rough, like under a microscope. You see that they're bumpy. Yeah, it's got to be a perfect triangle, but it doesn't exist, right? It's an unexemplified shape. The only shapes that exist are rough shapes. Right. But triangularity seems like it doesn't. All right, so it's outside of space and time. Makes it an abstract entity. All right, what was the second characteristic? Anybody? Well, some say that concrete entities have contingent existence. They're subject to creation and destruction, at least in most cases. Whereas abstract entities are not subject to creation and destruction. Like you can't destroy dragonhood because it exists and there aren't any dragons already. So
But if you destroy it, if you kill all the humans who believe in or think about it, then it's destroyed.
well, that would be true if dragonhood was a mental concept, which some people hold. But they're people who only believe in concrete entities who hold that. Those who believe in abstract entities say that so long as dragons are possible in the world, dragonhood as a form must still exist. Otherwise, what would make it possible that there are dragons? If there's a possibility that there are dragons, that must be grounded in something about the world. And what could that be except dragonhood? The quality. That quality is possibly had, even though not actually had. So it exists in some other possible world, so to speak. A dragonhood would have to be a necessary being, or even though dragons would be contingent beings. Yeah. Like triangularity would be a necessary being because there are necessary axioms about, necessary theorems, necessarily true theorems about triangles, which would have to be true even if there are no triangles. Like that every triangle contains 180 degrees. That's a provable truth even though there are no triangles at all. So, what's it true in virtue of, then? Some necessary properties of that quality of triangularity, according to Platonists, anyway. The third characteristic had to do with, or was that let's see, how many have we had? We had concrete things are in space and time, abstract not. We had that concrete things are what? Subject to creation and destruction, abstract things not. Now we can say that concrete things have contingent existence and abstract things have necessary existence. And fourth, many abstract things can be shared. Like, so triangularity and canininity and felininity are all shareable qualities. You can have many dogs, many cats, many triangles. Concrete things aren't shareable. So you can't have many Rovers or many Felixes or many triangular
You're
things.
saying like there can't be two of the same, exact same concrete.
Yeah. Yeah, because then there'd be two. It wouldn't be the same concrete thing. But you can have many instances of the abstract, many cases of triangularity, all exactly alike. So this is basically means that abstract properties and relations are shareable, whereas concrete things are not shareable. You can't have many things, all of whom are rover, but you can have many things, all of which have dogness. In other words, you can have many dogs, but not many rovers. Just one rover. Okay. Okay, now two. Define these terms. So Platonic realism, what does that say? That says that there are abstract universals, abstract shareable qualities and relations that exist both apart from the mind and apart from things. So it says basically that things like dragonhood can exist apart from the existence of any dragons and apart from any minds that think of dragons. So dragonhood can exist even if there are no dragons and there are no thinkers who conceive of dragons. Dragonhood could still exist as a quality, which is just waiting to be exemplified. That's what the Platonic realist holds.
So basically,
They're extreme belief. They believe in it. Yeah, they believe in the real, genuine existence of these abstract forms, whether anything has the form or not. So long as something possibly has the form, it's all good. All right. The Aristotelian realist says there are abstract universals which exist apart from the mind, but which can only exist in things. This is sometimes referred to as moderate realism. The idea here is that dragonhood doesn't really exist, but hoarseness does. Dragonhood can only exist in the mind, yeah, but it wouldn't be a property then. It would just be an idea of the mind. So moderate realists only believe in those abstract universals which are exemplified in concrete things. So they would say dogness, catness, horseness all exist. Right, but they would deny the existence of dragonhood because there are no dragons. But they do not say that thinkers are needed for universals to exist. So for the moderate realist, if three rocks exist, there would be the universal of rockiness that would be exemplified by the three rocks. Even if there were no thinkers to think of that, they would share that quality of being rocks. So Aristotle doesn't see the need for anybody to think of it, because he said things existed way before thinkers existed, like planets and stars. So why wouldn't the properties of those things also predate the origin of thinkers. That's his philosophy. Okay, then you have nominalism. Nominalism says that only concrete entities exist. There are no abstract universals. There are red things and triangular things and cats and dogs, but no catness, dogness, redness, and triangularity. And goodness knows no dragonhood, since there are no dragons in any event. So that's nominalism. Conceptualism is a form of nominalism. That's the other term there. Conceptualism says that universals are just mental constructions that exist as ideas in our minds. So they have no abstract qualities. They're just ideas or images in our minds or brains.
So like even concrete things are only in our mind.
No. Well, Berkeley says that. And he is a conceptualist, but that's extending conceptualism to a more full-blown idealism, which says that everything is ideas.
So what is conceptualism about universals?
Yeah, it just says that conceptualism about universals says that universals are mental constructions. So it'd say that dogness is just their idea of a dog. Dragonhood is just their idea of dragons, and so on. It doesn't necessarily say anything about physical objects. Idealism says that physical objects and universals are all ideas. That's Berkeley's view. So he is a conceptualist, and that goes with idealism. But you can be a conceptualist and not be an idealist. Right? All right, we're out of time, so we will resume with our review on Thursday.